I've always been the type of person who finds comfort in solitude. While most people my age were out at crowded bars or music festivals, I was the one volunteering to watch a friend's cat or stay at an empty apartment while they traveled. There's a specific kind of peace you only find in a house that isn't yours, a temporary life you get to try on like a coat before returning to your own reality. But after what happened last October, I don't think I'll ever be able to step into a house alone again. It started with an app called Haven. It's one of those high-end, invite-only platforms for estate management. It's basically house-sitting for the 1%. You don't just sign up, you have to be vetted, provide a background check, and have at least 3 professional references. I had done a few stints in the city, mostly watering expensive tropical plants in penthouses, so my rating was perfect. That's how I got the notification for the Blackwood project. The listing was vague but lucrative. It paid 3 times the usual rate for a 10-day stay at a property in the deep woods of Washington state, about 3 hours north of Seattle. The owners, a couple named Arthur and Elena Vance, were traveling to Europe for their 40th anniversary. The photos were breathtaking. The house was a masterpiece of mid-century modern design, all floor-to-ceiling glass, dark cedar beams, and polished concrete floors. It sat on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking a gray, churning stretch of the Pacific. I remember thinking, this is too good to be true. I should have listened to that thought. The drive up was beautiful in that eerie Pacific Northwest way. The mist clung to the Douglas firs like wet wool, and the road grew narrower and more potholed the further I got from the highway. By the time I reached the gate, the sun was already dipping behind the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gravel drive. Arthur Vance met me at the door. He was a tall, reed-thin man with silver eyes that seemed a bit too bright, a bit too alert. He didn't look like a man about to go on vacation. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. His wife, Elena, was nowhere to be seen, though Arthur mentioned she was already in the car, anxious to beat the fog. "It's a simple enough system, Maya," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp as he led me through the cavernous living room. The view was staggering, a wall of glass looking out into the darkening woods. It felt like being in an aquarium, only the fish were the trees and the predators were somewhere out in the dark. "The lights are automated." He pointed to the sleek tablet mounted on the kitchen wall. "The perimeter cameras are always active. You don't need to do anything. If an alarm sounds, it's likely just a deer or a fallen branch. The sensors are sensitive. Just ignore it. The security company handles everything remotely." He handed me a single heavy brass key. It looked strangely old-fashioned compared to the high-tech interior of the house. "This is the only physical key to the front door," Arthur said, staring at it for a second too long before dropping it into my palm. "Keep it on you, even when you're inside. The doors have a habit of locking themselves if the power flickers, and out here, the power flickers often." He didn't stay long. He gave me a brief tour, the kitchen, the master suite with its own glass wall, and a locked door at the end of the hallway he casually dismissed as storage. Within 20 minutes, he was gone. I stood on the porch and watched his black SUV disappear into the mist, the red taillights fading until the world was nothing but silence and the sound of the wind whistling through the firs. I went back inside and locked the door. I remember the sound of the bolt sliding home, a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the empty house. I felt a momentary surge of excitement. This was luxury. I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle they'd left on the counter and sat on the oversized leather sofa watching the forest disappear into total blackness. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. The house was quiet, but not empty quiet. It's the kind of quiet that feels pressurized, like the air in a cave. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard a soft, rhythmic clicking sound. It was coming from the tablet on the wall. I walked over to it. The screen was black, but as I approached, it flickered to life. It wasn't showing a menu or a security dashboard. It was a floor plan of the house. A small blue dot was pulsing in the center of the living room. Me. I moved a few steps to the left towards the kitchen. The blue dot moved with me, mirroring my steps with eerie precision. I walked to the hallway. The dot followed. It was a motion tracking system, likely for the lights, I reasoned. But then I noticed something else. On the far end of the floor plan, in the area marked as the storage room, the one Arthur said was locked, there was a second dot. It wasn't blue. It was red. And it wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, pulsing slowly in the dark of that locked room. My heart gave a small, uncomfortable thump. I told myself it was probably just a sensor malfunction, or maybe a piece of equipment that was still turned on. I decided to head to bed early to shake off the nerves. I made sure the brass key was on the nightstand right next to my hand. I crawled into the massive bed, the glass wall in front of me making it feel like I was sleeping outside in the elements. I was just drifting off, that hazy state between wakefulness and sleep, when a sound snapped my eyes wide open. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy bolt sliding back. Not the front door. It was closer, much closer. It was the sound of the locked door at the end of the hallway, opening. I lay there, frozen, my breath hitching in the back of my throat. The sound had been so mechanical, so final. In a house this quiet, sounds don't just happen, they resonate. I waited for a follow-up, a footstep, a creep of a floorboard, the rustle of clothing, but there was nothing. Just the low, rhythmic hum of the house's climate control and the distant, muffled roar of the ocean hitting the cliffs below. I looked at the brass key on the nightstand. It sat there, cold and mocking. Arthur had said this was the only physical key to the front door, but he hadn't said anything about the interior locks. My mind raced through a dozen rationalizations. Maybe the house had a timed pressure release. Maybe the old wood was settling in the cold night air. But I knew what I'd heard. It was the sound of a deadbolt being retracted. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I gripped the phone. The screen's glow felt blinding in the pitch-black room. I didn't call 911, not yet. I didn't want to be the crazy girl who called the police because a house made a noise on the first night. Instead, I opened the Haven app, hoping there was some kind of emergency contact or a manual for the house's smart system. The app was unresponsive, showing a spinning loading icon. The signal out here was abysmal. I realized I couldn't stay in that bed. The glass wall, which had felt so luxurious an hour ago, now made me feel like a specimen in a jar. If someone was outside, they could see me perfectly. If someone was inside, I was trapped in a room with only one exit. I slid out from under the heavy duvet, the cold concrete floor sending a shock up my legs. I didn't put on shoes. I wanted to be silent. I grabbed the heavy brass key, my only weapon as pathetic as that was, and crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway was a long, dark throat leading back to the main living area. The only light came from the moon, filtered through the thick Washington mist, casting a ghostly blue-gray pallor over everything. I pressed my back against the wall, moving inch by inch. When I reached the corner of the living room, I peered toward the kitchen. The security tablet was still glowing. I felt a sick sense of dread as I approached it. I needed to see that floor plan. I needed to see if that red dot was still there. As I got closer, the tablet's motion sensor triggered, and the screen brightened. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. The blue dot, me, was standing in the kitchen. The red dot was no longer in the storage room. It was in the hallway. Specifically, it was positioned exactly where I had been standing 3 minutes ago, right outside the master bedroom door. My heart began to hammer against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. The tracking was real time. Whoever or whatever that red dot represented, it was moving through the house with purpose. But as I stared at the screen, the red dot began to move again. It didn't move toward me. It turned and started heading back toward the living room, the very room I was currently standing in. I ducked behind the large kitchen island, pressing my chest against the cold marble. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I waited for the sound of footsteps on the concrete, but there was silence. This house was designed to be sleek and seamless. The floors didn't creak. The rugs were thick.
Someone could be standing 5 feet away from me and I wouldn't hear a thing. Then I heard it, a faint electronic chirp. It came from the tablet. I risked a glance over the edge of the counter. A message had popped up on the screen, overlaying the floor plan. It was a simple, system-level notification. Guest access granted. Secondary entry. My blood turned to ice. Secondary entry? Arthur had said there was only one key. Suddenly, the automated lights in the living room began to dim. Not all at once, but slowly, fading to a deep, dark crimson, the night mode Arthur had mentioned. In the red light, the shadows of the forest outside the room seemed to reach into the floor like long, black fingers. I stayed huddled behind the island, clutching the brass key so hard the edges dug into my palm. I needed to get to the front door. It was only 20 feet away. If I could just bolt for it, I could get to my car, drive until I hit the main road, and never look back. I gathered my courage, preparing to spring. I looked toward the front door, squinting through the crimson gloom. The door was shut, but the heavy brass bolt, the one I had personally slid into place, was standing open, and resting on the floor, right in the center of the welcome mat, was something that hadn't been there when I arrived. It was a pair of shoes, small, muddy, and worn-out sneakers, pointed toward the interior of the house, as if someone had just stepped out of them and walked inside.
The sight of those shoes hit me harder than a physical blow. They weren't the shoes of a high-end estate owner or a professional security guard. They were tattered, caked in the dark, peaty mud of the Washington woods, and they looked small, like they belonged to a teenager or a very small woman. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the intimacy of the act. Someone had taken the time to remove their shoes, to make themselves comfortable, to signal that they weren't just passing through. They were home. I stayed crouched behind the kitchen island, my mind spinning. The red light of the night mode turned the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces into something that looked like it belonged in a slaughterhouse. My eyes darted back to the tablet. The red dot was gone. Not moved away or hidden, the icon had simply vanished from the screen. The blue dot, representing me, sat alone in the center of the kitchen. For a heartbeat, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe the system had reset, maybe it was a glitch, but then I remembered the deadbolt. I remembered the shoes. I knew I couldn't stay behind that island forever. My car keys were sitting on the coffee table in the center of the living room, right in the line of sight of those massive glass windows. To get them, I'd have to expose myself. I began to crawl. I kept low, my stomach dragging against the cold floor, moving toward the living area. Every time the wind gusted outside, rattling the heavy glass panes, I jumped, convinced it was the sound of a window shattering. The forest outside was a wall of ink, and I realized with a jolt of pure vertigo that while I couldn't see anything out there, anyone in the trees could see me perfectly under these red lights. I was a glowing target. I reached the edge of the rug. My hand shot out, grasping the cold metal of my keychain. I tucked them into my pocket, the jingle sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Just the door now, I told myself, just 20 feet to the door. I stood up, keeping my knees bent, and lunged toward the foyer. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed out. I reached the heavy oak door and grabbed the handle. I turned it, expecting the cool air of the night to hit my face. It didn't budge. I yanked harder, a whimper escaping my throat. The handle turned, but the door stayed seated in its frame. I looked up. The manual brass bolt I had seen open moments ago was now slid firmly back into the locked position. My heart did a violent somersault. I hadn't heard the bolt move. I was 10 feet away, and I hadn't heard a sound. I frantically grabbed the thumb turn of the deadbolt to slide it back, but it wouldn't move. It felt as though it had been welded shut. I realized then that this wasn't just a manual lock. It was an electronic hybrid. The guest access notification I'd seen earlier, it hadn't just let someone in, it had locked me in. "Arthur!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Arthur, let me out!" There was no response, only the sound of the waves and the wind. I turned away from the door, backing into the center of the room, my eyes searching the shadows of the ceiling and the corners of the hallways.
That's when I heard the humming. It was low, melodic, and horribly out of tune. It's the sound a child makes when they're distracted, a soft that seemed to be coming from the vents in the floor. It moved from the kitchen side of the room toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I looked back at the security tablet. The screen flickered, the floor plan disappeared, and a new window opened. It was a live feed from one of the internal cameras, the one in the master bedroom where I had been sleeping only 10 minutes ago. The camera was angled toward the bed. The covers were tossed back, exactly as I had left them, but someone was sitting on the edge of the mattress. It was a woman. She was wearing a rain poncho that was dripping wet, the hood pulled low over her face. She was holding something in her lap, my sweater. She had opened it and was slowly, methodically folding my clothes. She picked up one of my sweaters, pressed it to her face, and took a long, deep breath. Then, as if she knew I was watching, she turned her head toward the camera. Under the hood, I couldn't see her eyes, only a wide, jagged grin that seemed to stretch too far across her pale face. She raised her hand and pointed a finger directly at the camera. Then she slowly moved that finger to her lips in a shushing motion. A second later, the security tablet screen went black, and every single light in the house, including the red emergency lights, snuffed out at once. I was standing in total, absolute darkness, and then, from the hallway just a few feet away, I heard the soft, wet sound of bare feet stepping onto the concrete floor. Slap, slap, slap. She was coming out.
The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight. In a house made almost entirely of glass, you'd expect some ambient light from the moon or the stars, but the fog had thickened into a soup of grayish black, sealing the house off from the rest of the world. I stood paralyzed in the center of the living room, my hands out in front of me, feeling the air for any change in pressure. Slap, slap, slap. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. She wasn't running, she wasn't rushing to grab me. She was navigating the space with the confidence of someone who lived there, someone who knew exactly where the furniture ended and the open space began. I forced myself to move. I knew the layout well enough to remember the large sectional sofa was to my right. I drifted toward it, my feet silent on the rug. My mind was screaming at me to break a window, but these weren't standard panes. They were triple-glazed, reinforced hurricane glass. I'd need a sledgehammer to even crack them, and the only thing I had was a brass key and my cell phone. I pulled my phone out, not to call for help, I knew the signal was dead, but to use the flashlight. I hesitated. A light would show me where she was, but it would also act as a beacon, a literal "here I am" sign in the dark. I took the risk. I flicked the light on for a fraction of a second. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a slice of the hallway. She was there. She was standing perfectly still, about 15 feet away. She had taken off the rain poncho. Underneath, she wore a thin, tattered floral dress that looked like it belonged in the 1970s. Her skin was a translucent, sickly white, and her hair was a matted nest of dark tangles. But it was her face that made my stomach turn. She wasn't a teenager. She was older, maybe in her 50s, but her movements had a jerky, youthful elasticity. She was staring right at the spot where I had been standing a second ago. I flicked the light off and dove behind the sofa. Maya. The voice was a wet whisper, like air escaping a punctured tire. She knew my name. Of course she did. She'd probably been through my luggage, my ID, my life. "Arthur said you were pretty," she whispered. The sound seemed to bounce off the glass walls, making it impossible to tell exactly which direction it was coming from. "He said you'd be a good one, a quiet one." My heart stopped. Arthur. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a handoff. The private community app, the high pay, the anniversary trip. It was all a setup. I wasn't here to watch the house. I was the gift left in the house. "I'm not supposed to come out yet,"
she continued, her voice moving closer. I could hear the wet click of her tongue against her teeth. I haven't had a visitor in so long. The last one, she wasn't very good at the game. She cried too much. I felt a cold sweat break out across my entire body. I reached into my pocket and felt the brass key. Arthur said to keep it on you. Why? If it didn't open the front door anymore, what was it for? I remembered the tour, the storage room at the end of the hall. He'd dismissed it so quickly. I realized now that the red dot on the tablet wasn't just a person, it was a beacon. The system was designed to track the guest and the resident. I heard a metallic scrape. She was dragging something across the concrete. A knife? A tool? "Let's play a game, Maya," she said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "If you can get back to the bedroom and lock the door before I count to 10, I'll let you sleep. But if I catch you, well, Arthur says I'm allowed to keep a trophy. 1. I didn't wait for 2. I bolted. I didn't head for the bedroom. That was a death trap. Instead, I ran toward the kitchen, toward the only other exit I could think of, the mudroom leading to the garage. If I could get to the garage, I could manually pull the emergency release on the door and get to my car. 2, 3. I hit the kitchen island, bruising my hip, but I didn't stop. I swung around the corner, my hands frantically searching the wall for the mudroom door. I found the handle. I turned it. Locked. 4, 5. I felt a sob rising in my throat. I turned back toward the living room, my flashlight cutting a wild arc through the dark. I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the room, her head tilted at an impossible angle, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. She wasn't counting anymore. She was just smiling. She raised the object in her hand. It wasn't a knife. It was a remote control. She pressed a button, and suddenly a high-pitched, ear-piercing shriek filled the house. It was the security alarm, but it wasn't a siren. It was a recording of a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. In the chaos of the noise, she lunged. She moved with terrifying speed, sprawling across the floor like an insect. I scrambled backwards, tripping over a bar stool, and fell hard on the concrete. I looked up just as she reached the edge of the kitchen, but she didn't come for my throat. She stopped at the invisible line where the tile met the wood of the living room. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes darting to the brass key that had fallen out of my pocket and was sliding across the floor toward the locked storage room door. She looked at the key, then back at me, and her expression shifted from predatory to genuine bone-chilling terror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the recorded screams. "Not that door. Don't go near that door."
The shift in the woman's demeanor was so jarring, it gave me a momentary physical vertigo. A second ago, she was a predator, a twisted inhabitant of a glass nightmare. Now she was shrinking back, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the brass key. The recorded screaming of the alarm continued to blare, a wall of sound that made it impossible to think. But her fear was louder than the noise. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of the room. I scrambled across the floor, my fingers grazing the cold brass of the key. I snatched it up and scrambled to my feet, backing away from her toward the hallway. The woman stayed at the edge of the kitchen, her eyes wide, flickering between me and the ceiling, as if she expected the very house to collapse upon her for even mentioning the door. "He's watching," she hissed, her voice a sharp needle through the shroud of the alarm. "The cameras. He never leaves. Even when he's gone, he never leaves." Suddenly, the alarm scream cut out. The silence that followed was even more violent. It rang in my ears, heavy and suffocating. Then a voice boomed through the house's integrated speaker system. It wasn't the distorted, recorded scream from before. It was Arthur. "Maya." His voice was calm, paternal, and chillingly clear. "I see you've met Sarah. I apologize for her lack of manners. She's been unsocialized for quite some time. Sarah, go back to your quarters, now."
The woman, Sarah, let out a whimpering sound, a noise like a kicked dog, and immediately turned, disappearing into the darkness of the kitchen. I heard a door click shut. I was alone in the living room again, but the illusion of being alone was gone. Arthur was watching me through the lenses hidden in the smoke detectors, the vents, the walls. "Now, Maya," Arthur's voice continued, "you have the key. I told you to keep it on you. It's a test of character, really. Most people are too afraid to use it. They stay in the bedroom, they hide under the covers, and eventually Sarah gets bored and, well, we have to find a new house-sitter. But you're different. You're curious." I looked at the brass key in my hand. The storage room door was only 10 feet away at the end of the hall. "The door, Maya," Arthur whispered through the speakers. "Open it. If you do, I'll let you walk out the front door. I'll even double your fee. Think of it as a final inspection." I knew it was a lie. People like Arthur don't let witnesses walk away with double fees. But I also knew the front door was electronically deadlocked. The garage was sealed. The windows were unbreakable. This house was a machine designed to funnel me toward that specific door. It was the only variable left. I walked down the hallway, my legs feeling like lead. My phone's flashlight was dying, the beam flickering and yellowing. I reached the door. It was plain dark wood, lacking the sleek glass inserts of the rest of the house. No handle, only a single oversized keyhole. I inserted the brass key. It fit perfectly. And as I turned it, I expected a jump scare, Sarah leaping out, or a trap springing. But the door just gave a heavy mechanical clunk and swung inward on silent hinges. I stepped inside and flicked my light around. It wasn't a storage room. It was a control center. One wall was covered in monitors, dozens of them. Some showed the interior of the house I was in, but others showed different locations. I saw a suburban bedroom where a child was sleeping. I saw a dark park bench. I saw the interior of a car I recognized, my own car, parked at the bottom of the hill, with a small black box attached to the undercarriage. In the center of the desk was a leather-bound journal. I stepped forward, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my teeth. I opened the journal to the last entry. It was dated today. Subject: Maya. High resilience. Minimal panic in Phase 1. Sarah is agitated. The resemblance to the 2014 subject is triggering her. If Maya reaches the archive, move to Phase 2. The harvest. My breath hitched. I flipped back through the pages. There were photos clipped to the paper, dozens of women. Some were crossed out with thick red ink. Others had notes like failed, too loud, or incompatible. Then I saw a photo of Sarah. She looked different, younger, vibrant, standing in front of a university library. Underneath it read, Sarah Miller, captured 2019, current status, resident/enforcer, deteriorating. I wasn't a house-sitter. I was a candidate for a vacancy I didn't want to fill. A soft whirring sound came from behind me. I turned my flashlight toward the corner of the room. A large industrial-sized server rack was humming, but that wasn't what caught my eye. It was the floor. There was a glass tile in the center of the room, looking straight down into a sub-basement. My light hit the space below, and I nearly dropped the phone. Beneath the storage room was a small, white-walled cell, and sitting in that cell, looking up at the ceiling with a vacant, hollow stare, was the real Arthur Vance. He was older, frailer than the man who had met me at the door, and his hands were shackled to the wall. If that was the real Arthur, then who had I met at the door? I heard a footstep behind me, not the wet slap of Sarah's bare feet. This was the heavy, rhythmic tread of a man's dress shoes. Phase 2, a voice said from the doorway. I turned. The man who called himself Arthur was standing there, silhouetted by the hallway light. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a surgical mask and a small pressurized canister. You really shouldn't have looked at the journal, Maya. It spoils the surprise.
The man stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of the hallway. In his hand, the pressurized canister hissed, a tiny, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. I backed away, my heels hitting the edge of the glass floor tile. Below me, the real, emaciated Arthur Vance didn't even blink. He remained a statue of broken spirit, a warning of what happened to those who were kept rather than harvested. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the high-tech tomb. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the architect, Maya. Arthur was just the financier. He built this place to keep his secrets in. I just repurposed it to keep people like you safe." He took a step forward. I looked down at the glass tile at my feet. It wasn't just a window, it was a hatch. I saw the faint outline of a finger pole recessed into the corner. It was a desperate, suicidal move, dropping into a cell with a captive, but it was the only direction the architect wasn't standing. "Don't," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "That's a one-way trip, Maya." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I dropped my dying phone into my pocket, gripped the recessed handle, and yanked. The glass hatch was heavier than it looked, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It swung upward with a groan of hydraulic fluid. The architect lunged, the canister spraying a sweet-smelling vapor into the air. I didn't breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut and jumped. It was a 10-foot drop. I hit the white-tiled floor of the cell below with a bone-jarring thud. A sharp, hot spike of pain shot through my left ankle, and I let out a muffled scream. I rolled onto my side, gasping for clean air away from the settling mist above. Upstairs, the architect stood over the open hatch, peering down at me. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a scientist watching a lab rat take a wrong turn in a maze. "You've reached the basement, Maya, but the basement has no doors. It only has the vents, and Sarah is very, very good at crawling through vents." He reached down and slammed the glass hatch shut. The click of the electronic lock was final. I was in a 10 by 10 white cube. The light was clinical, hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, and smelled of bleach and old copper. In the corner, the man I assumed was the real Arthur Vance finally moved. He turned his head slowly, his neck creaking like rusted hinges. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. "Another one," he whispered. His voice was a ghostly thread of sound. "He likes the ones with dark hair. He thinks you look like his mother." "Arthur!" I dragged myself toward him, my ankle throbbing in time with my heartbeat. "How do I get out? There has to be a way out." Arthur let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. He raised his shackled hands, pointing toward a small steel grate near the ceiling. "The ventilation. It leads to the cliffside, to the exhaust fans, but you won't make it. Sarah lives in the walls. She's the one who feeds me. She's the one who cleans up." I looked at the grate. It was barely a foot wide. I looked at my hands, then back at the hatch above. I had to move. If the architect was phased too, I didn't want to be around for the start of the harvest. I dragged a small, bolted-down stool toward the wall, ignoring the agony in my leg. I stood on it, reaching for the grate. My fingers brushed the cold steel. It wasn't screwed in. It was held by magnetic catches. This was a maintenance tunnel. I pulled the grate free, and a gust of cold, salty air hit my face. It was the first breath of hope I'd had all night. But as I gripped the edge of the duct to pull myself up, I heard a sound from deep inside the metal tunnel. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of long fingernails dragging against galvanized steel, and then from the darkness of the vent, a pair of wide, pale eyes reflected the dim light of the cell. "I found you," Sarah whispered from inside the wall. "My turn to be the hunter." I didn't retreat. I couldn't. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only heavy object I had left, the brass key. As Sarah's face lunged from the darkness of the vent, her teeth bared in a jagged snarl, I swung the heavy metal key with every ounce of terror-fueled strength I possessed. The key connected with something soft and wet. Sarah let out a shriek that sounded more like a wounded animal than human, and she recoiled back into the darkness.
Go, Arthur croaked from the floor. The exhaust, follow the wind. I hauled myself into the cramped, freezing metal tunnel, my shoulders scraping the sides. I didn't look back. I crawled toward the scent of salt and the sound of the ocean, while behind me I could hear Sarah recovering, her breathing coming in ragged, wet gulps as she began to pursue me through the narrow, dark veins of the house.
The ventilation shaft was a narrow, galvanized coffin. It was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the cold metal bit into my knees and elbows through my jeans. The air was a freezing cocktail of sea salt and machine oil, pulling me forward, but the darkness was absolute. I was crawling blind, my hands feeling for the rivets in the metal, while every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop. But I couldn't stop. Behind me, the sound of Sarah's pursuit was a rhythmic, metallic scraping, the sound of a predator that had spent years learning how to move through the skeleton of this house. Maya. Her voice echoed through the duct, distorted by the metal walls. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. The architect says you're a fighter. He likes that. It makes the meat firm. I pushed harder, ignoring the hot, wet sensation of my ankle bleeding into my sock. The tunnel slanted upward, then took a sharp 90-degree turn to the left. As I rounded the corner, I saw a sliver of light up ahead. It wasn't the white, clinical light of the cell. It was a flickering, bluish glow. I reached another grate and peered through. I was looking down into the master bedroom. From this vantage point, the room looked like a stage set. I could see my own suitcase, still half unpacked, but there was someone else in the room now. The architect was there. He was standing by the glass wall, looking out at the foggy forest, holding a tablet. "She's in the north sector ducts, Sarah," he said, his voice perfectly audible through the vent. He didn't need to. He knew she was listening. "Don't damage the thoracic cavity. I need the lungs intact for the next client. Just disable her." I held my breath, my face pressed against the cold steel of the grate. I watched him tap a command into the tablet. Suddenly, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the metal of the vent. It was a sound I didn't just hear. I felt it in my teeth, in my skull. It was an ultrasonic deterrent, the kind they use to keep rats out of warehouses, but dialed up to a sickening level. My head began to throb, and a wave of nausea nearly made me retch. I had to get out of this section of the house. I bypassed the bedroom grate and kept crawling. The tunnel narrowed even further, forcing me onto my stomach. I was sliding now, pushing off with my one good foot. The scent of the ocean was getting stronger, sharper, colder. I was getting close to the exterior exhaust. Clang! A heavy impact hit the metal right behind my feet. I kicked back blindly, my heel connecting with something that felt like a human face. Sarah shrieked, a high, piercing sound that vibrated through the floor of the duct. "You bit me!" she howled, her voice devolving into a guttural growl. I'll peel you like a fruit." I scrambled forward, my fingers catching at a loose piece of flashing. I yanked myself toward a large circular opening at the end of the line. I could see the massive blades of an industrial exhaust fan spinning slowly. Beyond it, the gray, misty moonlight of the Washington coast was calling to me, but the fan was still moving. If I tried to squeeze through, the blades would slice me to ribbons. I looked around frantically. To my right, there was a small maintenance bypass, a manual override lever. It was rusted, likely never used since the house was built. I grabbed it and pulled with everything I had. The lever didn't move. Behind me, I could hear Sarah's ragged breathing. She was only inches away. I could smell her now, the scent of wet earth and rot. Her hand, pale and claw-like, reached out of the darkness and gripped my wounded ankle. I screamed as she squeezed the injury, her fingernails digging into the open cut. She started to pull me backward, away from the light, away from the air. "My house," she hissed, her face appearing in the dim light of the fan. Her nose was broken from my kick, blood smearing her chin. My turn to be the lady of the house.
In a moment of pure, unadulterated survival instinct, I didn't pull away. I pushed back. I used the momentum of her pull to launch my body toward her, slamming my forehead into hers. The impact dazed us both, but it gave me a second of freedom. I didn't go for the lever again. I reached into my pocket, grabbed the heavy brass key, and jammed it directly into the gears of the exhaust fan. The sound was deafening, a screech of metal on metal, sparks showering the interior of the duct like fireworks. The fan bucked, the blades grinding to a violent shuddering halt as the brass key was crushed between the steel teeth of the motor. The path was clear. I lunged for the opening, sliding between the frozen blades. But as I reached the edge of the vent, I realized the exit wasn't a door to the ground. I was 40 feet up, hanging off the side of the cliffside wall. Below me was a sheer drop of jagged black rocks and the white, churning foam of the Pacific Ocean.
I hung there, half in and half out of the exhaust port, my fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the jagged edge of the metal casing. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes with salt spray. 40 feet below, the Pacific Ocean was a churning graveyard of black water and white foam, smashing against the rocks with a rhythmic, thunderous roar that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The house behind me, that architectural masterpiece of glass and cedar, now looked like a parasite clinging to the cliff, and I was the one it was trying to digest. "Maya?" The voice came from inside the vent. Sarah was there, her face silhouetted against the sparks still fluttering from the jammed motor. She couldn't reach me easily. The frozen fan blades acted as a serrated barrier between us, but she was reaching through the gaps, her fingers twitching like the legs of a dying spider. "Don't jump," she whispered, her voice strangely calm, almost melodic. "The water, it's so cold, it doesn't let you go. If you stay here, the architect will make it quick. He has the needles. He has the sleep." I looked down at the drop. Then I looked at the side of the house. A narrow maintenance ledge, barely 6 inches wide, ran along the perimeter of the second floor, designed for window washers who were presumably braver than I was. It led toward the far side of the estate, where the cliff sloped down into a thicket of pine trees. If I could reach that ledge, I might be able to shimmy around to the back of the house and find a way down to the beach. I didn't give myself time to think. If I thought, I'd realize how impossible this was. I swung my legs out, my sneakers searching for purchase on the slick cedar siding. I found the ledge. It was wet with mist and incredibly narrow. I pressed my chest and stomach flat against the side of the house, my arms spread wide, hugging the building like a lover I hated. "She's outside!" Sarah's voice shrieked, no longer melodic. She was screaming to the architect. "She's on the ledge! She's on the ledge!" Suddenly, the floodlights mounted under the eaves of the roof roared to life. The entire side of the house was bathed in a blinding, artificial white light. I was pinned against the wood, a moth on a board. I began to shuffle. Left foot, slide. Right foot, slide. Every time the wind gusted, I felt the house tremble, or maybe it was just me. Through the glass panes I was passing, I could see the interior of the house. I passed the master bedroom. Empty. I passed a library. Empty. Then I reached the living room, the great glass hall. I stopped. The architect was standing on the other side of the glass, only inches away from me. He was holding a glass of scotch in one hand and the control tablet in the other. He looked at me with a terrifyingly clinical curiosity. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a curator admiring a difficult piece of art. He raised the tablet and tapped a button. "The ledge is heated, Maya," his voice broadcast from an external speaker right above my head. "It's a very sophisticated system." I felt it before I heard the hum. The metal ledge beneath my feet began to grow warm, then hot. Within seconds, the heat was radiating through the rubber soles of my shoes. I hissed in pain, my grip on the cedar beams tightening. "You can't stay there, Maya," the architect said,
taking a sip of his drink. In about 60 seconds, the temperature will be high enough to cause second-degree burns. You have two choices. You can jump and end this now, or you can slide the window to your left. I've unlocked it for you. Come back inside, Maya. Let's finish the harvest with some dignity. To my left, one of the massive glass panels had indeed slid open a few inches. The warmth of the interior air wafted out, smelling of vanilla and expensive wood, and the metallic tang of the architect's needles. I looked at the window. I looked at the architect's smug, composed face, and then I looked past him. In the reflection of the glass, I saw Sarah. She had exited the vents and was standing in the living room behind the architect. She was dripping with oil and blood, her floral dress torn to rags. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the back of the architect's head. And in her hand, she was clutching a long, sharpened piece of one of the fan blades I had broken. She saw me see her. For a split second, our eyes met through the glass. In that moment, she wasn't the hunter. She was the first victim, the resident who had been broken until she became a tool. But she wasn't a tool anymore. She was a woman who had been reminded of what it felt like to be human when I fought back. The architect followed my gaze, beginning to turn around. "What are you—" He never finished the sentence. Sarah lunged, the jagged steel blade catching the light before it buried itself in the side of his neck.
The sound that followed was one I will never forget. It wasn't a scream, it was a wet, hollow thud, like a heavy book hitting a damp carpet. The architect's scotch glass shattered on the concrete floor, the amber liquid mingling instantly with the dark arterial spray that erupted from his neck. He slumped against the glass wall, the very wall I was clinging to, his eyes wide with a sudden, panicked realization that his sophisticated system had finally failed him. Sarah didn't stop. She was a blur of frantic, uncoordinated motion, stabbing blindly at the man who had turned her into a monster. It was a scene of primal, desperate gore, framed by the most expensive architecture money could buy. The ledge beneath my feet was now searingly hot. I could smell the faint scent of scorched rubber from my sneakers. I didn't have time to process the horror inside. I reached for the sliding glass door the architect had unlocked. My fingers fumbled with the handle and I yanked it open, stumbling into the living room just as the architect's body hit the floor. Sarah was standing over him, her chest heaving, the jagged fan blade trembling in her hand. She looked up at me, and for a heartbeat I thought she was going to finish the job, that I was just the next item on her list. "The car," she rasped, her voice cracking. She pointed toward the front door. "He has the real remote in his pocket. Go, before the system resets." I looked at the architect. He was still twitching, his fingers scratching at the polished concrete. I forced myself to reach down, my gorge rising as I fumbled through his jacket. My fingers closed around a heavy slate-gray key fob with a single silver button. "Come with me," I said, looking at Sarah. Despite everything, the hunting, the whispering, the terror, I couldn't leave her in this tomb. She looked at the glass walls, then out at the dark forest. She shook her head slowly, a ghostly, tragic smile touching her lips. "I've been in the dark too long, Maya. I don't know how to be in the light anymore. Besides, the real Arthur is still downstairs. Someone has to stay. Someone has to finish this." Suddenly, the house's speakers crackled to life. A pre-recorded, synthesized voice, the house's failsafe, began to announce, "Security compromise detected. Emergency lockdown initiating in 60 seconds. External authorities notified." "Go!" Sarah screamed. I turned and bolted for the front door. I hit the silver button on the fob, and I heard the heavy mechanical thud of the electronic deadbolts retracting. I threw the door open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical weight. I didn't look back. I didn't look at the shoes on the mat. I just ran. I reached my car at the bottom of the gravel drive. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the keys, but I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside.
I slammed the shifter into reverse and floored it, the tires spitting gravel as I spun the car around. As I sped down the narrow forest road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The Blackwood project was glowing on top of the cliff, but it wasn't the white floodlights or the red night mode. Bright orange flames were licking at the cedar beams. Sarah must have found the gas lines. The glass house was turning into a furnace. I drove until the forest gave way to the highway, until the mist cleared, and until I saw the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner. I pulled into the parking lot, put the car in park, and finally, for the first time since I arrived at that house, I let out a sound. It wasn't a scream, it was a long, jagged sob that felt like it was tearing my throat open. I sat there for an hour, watching the sunrise. But as the light began to fill the sky, I noticed something in the passenger seat. It was my phone. It had died hours ago, but now, plugged into my car's charger, it flickered to life. A notification was waiting for me. It was an email from the Haven app. It had been sent while I was still on the ledge. Dear Maya, we hope you are enjoying your stay at the Blackwood project. We noticed a brief lapse in your GPS signal. Please confirm your status. Also, be advised, a new guest has been vetted and is scheduled to arrive for the second half of your shift. Please ensure the storage room is prepared for her arrival. I looked at the date of the email. It had been sent from the Haven corporate headquarters. That's when I realized the architect wasn't a lone madman. He was an employee.
The diner was quiet, the only sound the hum of a refrigerator and the distant clink of a spatula against a griddle. I sat in my car, the heater blasting, but I couldn't stop shivering. I stared at the phone screen until the words of the email blurred into a series of jagged black lines. Ensure the storage room is prepared for her arrival. The Haven app wasn't just a high-end service, it was a marketplace, a dark web logistics chain disguised as a luxury lifestyle tool. They didn't just vet the sitters, they curated the inventory. The architect had been their regional manager, and Sarah had been a resident who had exceeded her shelf life. I didn't go to the local police, not right away. I knew enough about the world of the 1% to know that the local sheriff in a small coastal town probably had his mortgage paid by the estate management fees of the properties on that cliff. Instead, I drove 3 hours straight to the FBI field office in Seattle. I sat in a sterile, windowless room for 14 hours. I told them everything, the red dots, the glass hatch, the real Arthur Vance in the basement, and the woman with the fan blade. I gave them the brass key I had jammed into the fan and the slate-gray key fob. 2 days later, a lead agent named Miller sat down for me. He looked tired. He placed a folder on the table and slid out a satellite photograph. "We sent a team to the coordinates," Miller said. "The house is gone, Maya, leveled. The gas explosion was thorough. We found skeletal remains in the substructure, 2 individuals. One was likely the real Arthur Vance. The other," he paused. "We're still running DNA, but based on the dental records, it's likely Sarah Miller." "And the architect?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Miller shook his head. "No remains found that match his description, but we did find something else. The house wasn't just a house, it was a node. We found evidence of a hardline server buried 40 feet underground, encased in lead. It survived the fire." He opened the folder further, revealing a list of names. My heart stopped. It wasn't just my name. It was a list of hundreds of women across the country, all of them users of the Haven app. Next to each name was a status: in transit, archived, discarded. "The app was taken down an hour after you arrived at our office," Miller continued. "The company behind it, a shell corporation out of the Cayman Islands, vanished. Every server, every record, every trace of Haven has been scrubbed from the internet. They put me in witness protection for 6 months. I moved to a different state, changed my name, and dyed my hair. I don't sit for houses anymore. I live in a small, cramped apartment with no glass walls and 3 deadbolts on the door. The manual kind, the kind that don't have electronic overrides. But the trauma of a glass house doesn't leave you.
Every time I'm in a public place, a mall, an office building, a hotel, I look at the security tablets on the walls. I look for the floor plans. I look for the blue dots. And every time I see a flickering screen, my heart skips a beat, waiting for a red dot to appear. Last week, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a small velvet-lined box. I opened it, expecting a bomb or a threat. It was a key, a heavy brass key, identical to the one I'd used to open the storage room. I threw it in the river, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. The architect was just a title. The project was just a location. But the haven is still looking for sitters. Sometimes late at night, I'll be sitting in my darkened living room and I'll hear it. A soft, rhythmic click, 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 coming from my smart TV or my laptop. I've covered my cameras with black tape and I've disconnected the Wi-Fi, but the sound remains. It's the sound of someone, somewhere, tapping on a screen. And I know that somewhere out there, in another beautiful, secluded house with floor-to-ceiling windows, a girl is walking through the front door, marveling at the view, and picking up a brass key that she's been told to keep on her person at all times. I just hope she's a better runner than I was.